There is something deeply restful about imagining a place that was, above all else, a home. We tend to think of castles as cold things, all stone and silence and the distant echo of footsteps in empty corridors. We picture them as they are now, roofless and open to the sky, their great halls given over to grass and wind and the occasional curious sparrow. But close your eyes for just a moment and let that image soften. Let the roof come back. Let the wooden floors return, warm and slightly uneven underfoot, worn smooth by years of ordinary coming and going. Let the smell of wood smoke drift in from the great hearth at the center of the hall, that particular sweetness of oak and applewood burning low in the early morning. Let the sound of voices return, quiet at first, the way voices always are before the day has properly begun. This is the castle as it actually was. Not a monument, not a fortress waiting for something terrible to happen. A household, a busy, breathing, slightly complicated household, full of people who had work to do and meals to eat and beds to fall into at the end of a long day. And like any household, it had its rhythms and its routines, its familiar faces and its unspoken rules, its corners that smelled of lavender and its corners that smelled of something rather less pleasant. It was, in the most ordinary and comforting sense of the word, alive. To understand what daily life in a castle truly felt like, it helps to understand first just how many people lived and worked within those walls. A great lord's castle in the high medieval period was not home to one family alone. It was home to dozens, sometimes hundreds of people, all of them connected by the particular web of obligation and service and affection that held medieval society together. There were knights and their squires, ladies in waiting and their attendants, stewards and chamberlains and chaplains, cooks and bakers and brewers, grooms and falconers and laundresses, men who tended the fires and women who mended the linens and children who ran errands and occasionally got underfoot in ways that made the older servants sigh with patient exasperation. All of them lived, in one way or another, within the orbit of the castle. All of them were part of what contemporaries would simply have called the household. The word itself is worth sitting with for a moment. Household, it carries something warm inside it, something domestic and immediate. In medieval Latin, the term was often familia, which did not mean family in quite the way we use it today, but rather something closer to the whole circle of people bound to a lord's service and care. The lord was, in a very real sense, responsible for all of them. He fed them, he housed them. He settled their disputes and saw to their welfare, at least in theory, and they in turn gave him their labor and their loyalty and the daily texture of his life. It was a relationship built on mutual dependence, and when it worked well, it had a kind of warmth to it, a sense of belonging that was deeply rooted in the physical place itself. And the physical place was extraordinary, even by the standards of any age. Imagine approaching a great castle on a clear autumn morning, the kind of morning when the air is cool and slightly damp, and the light is the color of pale honey. You would see the walls first, rising above the tree line or the surrounding village, their stone faces weathered to a soft gray-brown that seems almost to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The gatehouse would be ahead of you, its arch wide enough for a laden cart to pass through, its wooden gates standing open in the ordinary way of a working day. As you passed beneath the arch, you would feel the temperature drop slightly, the way it always does when you move from open air into shadow. And you would hear the change in sound too. Voices and footsteps and the clank of metal becoming suddenly more present, more enclosed. Inside the outer ward, which is the open courtyard between the outer walls and the main buildings, the morning would already be well underway. This was the working heart of the castle in many ways. The place where the practical business of keeping so many people fed and sheltered and supplied was carried out in full view of anyone who happened to be passing. There would be a bakehouse here, probably its low stone building breathing out warmth and the thick, yeasty smell of bread already baking before most people had opened their eyes. There would be a brew house nearby, because ale was the everyday drink of the medieval household, safer than water and nourishing in its way. And the process of brewing it was constant and ongoing and filled the air with its own particular sweetness. There might be a smithy, its fire already hot, the sound of the hammer ringing out in a steady, almost meditative rhythm. There would be stables, long and low, smelling of hay and horses, and the particular warm animal smell that is, once you are used to it, not unpleasant at all. All of this activity, all of this noise and smell and purposeful movement, was organized and directed by a small group of senior officers whose job it was to keep the entire household running smoothly. The most important of these, in many ways, was the steward. The steward was the Lord's chief administrator, the person responsible for the overall management of the household and the estates that supported it. He would have been a man of considerable experience and education, someone who understood not only the practical details of running a large establishment, but also the social complexities of managing a community of people with very different ranks and temperaments and expectations. His day began early and ended late, and in between he would have dealt with an almost continuous stream of requests and reports and decisions, all of them requiring his attention, none of them quite as straightforward as they might have appeared. Below the steward were a number of other officers, each responsible for a particular department of the household. The chamberlain looked after the lord's private apartments, the inner rooms where the family actually lived and slept, and he managed the personal servants who attended directly on the lord and his family. The marshal was responsible for the horses and the stabling and the various men who worked in that part of the castle. The constable in a great castle was responsible for the garrison and the security of the building itself. The almoner managed the castle's charitable giving, which was considerable because the medieval church placed great emphasis on the duty of the wealthy to care for the poor. And the castle gate was a regular destination for people in need of food or assistance. And then there was the kitchen, which deserves a moment all its own. The medieval castle kitchen was not a quiet place. It was large, often surprisingly large, because feeding a household of this size required an industrial scale of preparation that we might find difficult to imagine today. There would be multiple hearths, some of them enormous, their fires burning at different temperatures for different purposes. There would be spits turning over the hottest flames, tended by small boys whose job it was to sit close to the heat and turn the handle at a steady pace, a task that required patience and a certain tolerance for discomfort. There would be long wooden tables where other cooks were working, chopping and mixing and kneading, their hands dusted with flour or stained with the juices of herbs and spices. The smell would have been extraordinary. A layered, complex thing, the sweetness of roasting meat and the sharp green scent of fresh herbs and the warm heaviness of bread and the faint metallic tang of the copper pots that hung in rows along the walls. The head cook, or master cook as he was sometimes called, was a figure of real authority in the castle hierarchy. He answered to the steward in matters of overall household management. But within his own domain, he was essentially sovereign. He planned the menus, directed the work of his staff, managed the stores of provisions that came in from the castle's estates and from the markets in the nearby town, and ensured that the two main meals of the day, dinner at midday and supper in the evening, were ready at the appointed hour. This was not a small responsibility. The quality of the food served in a great lord's hall was a matter of social prestige, a reflection of his wealth and his generosity and his standing in the world. And the master cook was the person who translated that prestige into something actual and edible and placed before the assembled household twice a day. The great hall itself was the center of castle life in a way that is perhaps difficult to fully appreciate from the perspective of our own time, when we are accustomed to eating in small family groups in rooms specifically designed for the purpose. In a medieval castle, the great hall was where almost everyone ate together. Lord and knight and servant, arranged according to rank along the long trestle tables that were set up each day and taken down again afterward. The lord and his immediate family and honored guests sat at the high table, raised slightly on a dais at one end of the hall, and the rest of the household arranged themselves in descending order of importance down the length of the room. This arrangement was not merely practical. It was a daily enactment of the social order, a reminder of where everyone stood in relation to everyone else. And it gave the household a kind of coherence and identity that was reinforced twice a day. Every day. The hall itself was a remarkable space. It would have been large, certainly with a high timber roof that disappeared into shadow above the smoke from the central hearth, or, in later castles, from the great fireplace set into one of the walls. The walls might have been hung with tapestries, which served the double purpose of decoration and insulation. Their woven scenes of hunting or feasting, or the lives of saints, adding color and warmth to what might otherwise have been a rather austere space. The floor might have been strewn with rushes, fresh ones laid down regularly over the old, along with dried herbs that released their fragrance when walked upon. Lavender and meadowsweet and rosemary. A gentle, slightly dusty smell that was the particular scent of the medieval interior. The windows would have been small, their openings fitted with wooden shutters or, in a wealthy household, with horn or even glass, and the light that came through them would have been soft and slightly diffuse. The kind of light that makes everything look a little warmer than it actually is. It is worth pausing here, in this imagined hall, and simply noticing how it feels. The warmth of the fire, the smell of the herbs underfoot, the sound of voices at the tables, the clatter of wooden bowls and the soft thud of a loaf of bread set down on the board. The occasional burst of laughter from somewhere further down the room. This was not a silent or a solemn place. It was full of the ordinary noise of people eating together. And there is something in that sound, that particular blend of conversation and appetite and communal ease, that feels deeply familiar even across the distance of centuries. Because this is, at its heart, what the castle was, a place where people came together at the end of the day, or the middle of it, and shared a meal and the warmth of a fire and the uncomplicated pleasure of being in company. The great political and social structures of the medieval world, the hierarchies of lord and vassal, the obligations of service and protection, all of these things were real and important, but they were lived out in the texture of ordinary days, in the small routines and the familiar faces and the smell of bread baking before dawn. The castle as a household was also, like any household, a place shaped by the personalities of the people who lived in it. A lord who was generous and sociable would have created a different atmosphere than one who was reserved and formal. A lady of the castle who took a close interest in the management of her household, as many did, would have left her particular mark on everything from the quality of the linen to the herbs grown in the kitchen garden. The senior servants who had been in the castle for many years would have developed their own small traditions and preferences, their own ways of doing things that had become simply the way things were done here, in this place, in this household. And the household changed over time, too, in the slow, organic way that all households do. Children were born and grew up and eventually left to make their own lives elsewhere. Servants grew old in their positions and were eventually replaced by younger ones who had to learn, gradually and sometimes awkwardly, the particular rhythms of this particular place. Guests arrived and stayed for a time and then departed, leaving behind them a faint trace of different habits and different stories. The castle was never static. It was always in the process of becoming, always slightly different from what it had been the season before, always carrying within it the accumulated weight of all the lives that had been lived inside its walls. There is something quietly extraordinary about that accumulation. The stone walls that look so permanent and unchanging to us now were, in their own time, the container for a constant flow of human life. All of it ordinary, most of it unrecorded. All of it real, the cook who rose before dawn to start the fires, the groom who spent his morning in the stables, talking quietly to the horses in the particular way that people who work with animals always do, the lady's maid who sat by a window in the late afternoon, the light falling across her work, her needle moving in and out of the fabric with the steady, unhurried rhythm of long practice. These are the lives we are going to spend some time with, in the chapters that follow. Not the great events, not the moments of drama and decision, but the long, quiet, ordinary days. The way the light moved through the castle from morning to evening. The sounds that marked the passage of time. The small pleasures and the small difficulties of a life lived in close community with many other people. In a building that was, whatever else it might have been, above all else a home. For now, let the image settle. The hall, the fire, the smell of wood smoke and herbs and fresh bread drifting in from the bakehouse across the yard. The sound of voices, unhurried and familiar. The castle as it was, on any ordinary morning, in any ordinary season. Simply going about the quiet business of being alive. And so the castle breathed its way into the day. Slowly, the way all old and settled things do. Without hurry, without fuss, simply following the pull of light and warmth and the body's own deep knowledge of what comes next. Nowhere was this more true than in the kitchens. Long before the great hall had stirred, long before the steward had lifted his head from his pillow, or the grooms had begun their slow shuffling toward the stables, The kitchen had already been awake. It had, in a sense, never quite gone to sleep. The great hearths, and in a castle of any size, there might be 2 or 3 of them, each one wide enough that a grown person could stand inside with arms outstretched and still not touch the sides. These hearths were banked at night, their embers buried under a thick blanket of ash to hold the heat close and quiet until morning. There was a particular skill to this, a kind of tenderness even, the way a cook or a kitchen boy would press the ash down with a long-handled iron tool, sealing the warmth inside like something precious, something worth keeping, and in the very earliest part of the morning, before the sky outside had decided what color it wanted to be, someone would come and coax those embers back to life. Imagine, if you will, the smell of that moment. The ash still cool on top, pale and soft as chalk, and then beneath it the faint orange glow, and the smell that rises when the first breath of air reaches it. Something dry and ancient and deeply familiar. The smell of fire remembering itself. A few pieces of wood, carefully chosen, laid just so. A gentle breath or the slow wave of a piece of sacking. And then the crackle, small at first, tentative like a conversation beginning in a quiet room, and then steadier, and then the warmth beginning to push outward into the stone-cold air of the kitchen. The kitchen itself was a room of considerable size, because it had to be. Stone floors worn smooth in certain paths where feet had traveled the same routes 10,000 times. From the hearth to the central table, from the table to the storage alcoves, from the alcoves back to the fire. The walls were dark with years of smoke, not in an unpleasant way, but in the way that old wood is dark, with a kind of depth to it, a richness that spoke of long use and long life. Hooks hung from the ceiling beams, and from those hooks hung things of all kinds. Bundles of dried herbs tied at the stem, their leaves gone papery and fragrant, giving off the faintest ghost of summer when a draft moved through. Onions strung together in long ropes, dried flowers used for flavoring, the occasional haunch or joint, wrapped in cloth to keep the flies from it. The floor near the hearths would already be warming, the stone soaking up the heat in that slow, patient way that stone has. And by mid-morning, those particular flagstones would be almost too warm to stand on for long. But in the early hours, they were merely comfortable underfoot, a small luxury in a room that was otherwise all hard surfaces and sharp edges and the constant need to be careful. The kitchen staff in a castle of reasonable size. Not a royal palace, not a tiny manor, but somewhere in the comfortable middle. Might number anywhere from a handful to a dozen or more, depending on the season and the occasion. There was the head cook, who held a position of genuine importance in the household, a person whose knowledge was practical and deep and hard-won. They knew not just how to prepare food, but when, in what order, with what timing, accounting for the fact that a roast needed hours over the fire, while a sauce needed only minutes, and that both needed to arrive at the table at the right moment and in the right condition. This was a kind of quiet mastery, unsung perhaps, but felt by everyone who sat down to eat. Below the head cook there were assistants, and below them the kitchen boys and girls who did the carrying and the fetching and the grinding and the turning of spits. These were often young, some of them very young, Children really starting their working lives in the warmth and noise of the kitchen. Learning by watching and doing. Absorbing the rhythms of the place the way children absorb everything. Through their hands and feet and noses. Through repetition and proximity. The morning's work began with bread, as it so often did. The ovens separate from the open hearths, built into the wall with their own small doors of iron or wood, needed to be heated first, and this was done by building a fire inside the oven itself, letting it burn until the stone walls had absorbed enough heat, and then raking out the ash and sliding the loaves in on long-handled wooden paddles. The timing of this was felt as much as measured. An experienced baker would hold their hand near the open oven door and know, from the quality of the heat on their palm, whether the temperature was right. Too cool and the bread would sit heavy and pale. Too hot and the crust would harden before the inside had finished. There was no thermometer, no dial. No number to consult, there was only knowledge. Held in the body, passed from one person to another over years of standing side by side in warm kitchens. The smell of bread baking is one of those smells that reaches something very old in us. Something that recognizes it before the thinking mind has quite caught up. In the castle kitchen, with the fire going and the loaves inside the wall oven, and the first gray light beginning to show through the high, narrow windows. That smell would have filled the room completely. Warm and yeasty and faintly sweet. Mixing with the wood smoke and the dried herbs and the particular clean stone smell of the floor after it had been swept. While the bread baked, other preparations were underway. Pottage, a thick, nourishing mixture of grains and vegetables, sometimes with a little meat or fat stirred through, was a staple of the daily diet for most people in the castle, from the kitchen staff themselves to the servants in the hall. A great iron pot would be hung over the fire on a chain or a hook, and into it would go whatever was available and appropriate for the season. In autumn, perhaps dried peas and leeks and a handful of barley, thickened slowly over the heat until it was rich and filling. In spring, fresh greens might be added, their color brightening the pale surface of the pot. The stirring of pottage was a slow and meditative task, the long wooden spoon moving in easy circles, the steam rising in soft curls toward the dark ceiling. There was always something soaking, something steeping, something resting, dried beans that had been left in water overnight, swelling slowly back toward softness. Dried fruit plumped in a little ale or water for use in a sauce or a pudding. Salt fish that needed long soaking to draw out the brine before it could be cooked and eaten. The kitchen operated on multiple timescales at once. The immediate and urgent business of the morning meal, the slower preparation for the midday and evening, and the very long preparation that stretched back days or even weeks. The preserving and drying and salting and pickling that kept the household fed through the leaner months. Salt was everywhere in the medieval kitchen. It was not merely a seasoning, but a technology, the primary means by which food was kept from spoiling in a world without cold storage. Great ceramic crocks held salted meats and fish. Barrels of brine stood in the cooler corners of the storage rooms adjoining the kitchen. The salt itself was stored carefully, kept dry, protected from damp, because damp salt was salt that had failed in its purpose. A cook's relationship with salt was intimate and constant, a daily negotiation between too much and too little. between preservation and palatability. The spice cabinet, if the household was prosperous enough to have one, was kept locked. Spices, pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg had traveled extraordinary distances to reach a kitchen in northern France or England or the German lands, coming along trade routes that stretched back through Venice and Constantinople and beyond, through deserts and mountain passes and across wide seas. By the time they reached a castle kitchen, they were precious, to be used with care and intention. A pinch of this, a small measure of that. Their fragrance released into a sauce or a broth like something rare being shared. The smell of cinnamon warming in a pot of spiced wine, or cloves being ground in a small stone mortar, would have been a particular kind of luxury. A warmth within warmth, a sweetness that carried with it the faint suggestion of faraway places. But most of what the kitchen produced day to day was simpler than that. Bread and pottage and roasted meat and boiled vegetables and simple sauces made from the drippings of the fire. Food that was honest and filling and made with skill but not with extravagance, because extravagance was saved for feast days and the entertainment of important guests. And on an ordinary morning in an ordinary season, the kitchen's job was simply to feed people well and on time. The light through the high windows would be changing now, shifting from the deep blue-gray of very early morning towards something warmer, something with a little gold in it. The fire in the hearths was fully alive. The bread was in the oven. The pottage was simmering, and the kitchen had found its rhythm for the day. People moved through the space with the particular ease of those who know exactly where everything is and what needs to happen next, stepping around each other without collision, reaching past each other without friction, the whole room operating like a kind of slow, warm, purposeful dance. There would have been sounds. Of course, the steady low roar of the fire, the occasional pop and shift of a log settling, the soft thud of the bread paddle being set down against the wall, the rhythmic scraping of a knife against a board as someone prepared vegetables, the pieces falling with small soft sounds into a waiting bowl. Voices, but not loud voices. The quiet talk of people at work together. A word here, a short answer there. The kind of conversation that doesn't interrupt the hands. Someone might hum without quite being aware of it. Some fragment of a tune that had no particular beginning or end. Just a few notes repeated in a comfortable loop. Outside, the castle yard was beginning to wake. The sounds of the kitchen were joined now by sounds from elsewhere. The distant clang from the smithy, where the fires were also being coaxed to life. The low voices of the stable boys. The occasional sound of hooves on cobblestones. But in the kitchen, these sounds were muffled and far away, filtered through thick stone walls. And the room kept its own interior weather. Warm and fragrant and self-contained. A world within a world. The head cook would have been moving through this space with a kind of quiet authority, checking the bread, tasting the pottage, directing a word to one person and then another, making the small adjustments that kept everything on course, not commanding so much as guiding, the way a river guides itself around a stone, not with force but with the accumulated wisdom of knowing its own course. There was satisfaction in this work, a deep and ordinary satisfaction, the kind that comes from doing something necessary and doing it well, from feeding people who will be hungry and knowing that when they sit down at the table what they find there will be good. By the time the bell rang for the first meal of the day, a simple breakfast for the household, bread and perhaps some cold meat or cheese and something warm to drink, ale perhaps or a thin broth. The kitchen had already been at work for several hours. The bread that came out of the oven now was warm all the way through, its crust giving a soft crackling sound when pressed, its interior the color of cream, its smell filling the corridor outside the kitchen door as the loaves were carried toward the hall. The pottage was thick and ready, ladled into the great serving vessels that would be carried to the tables. And in the kitchen itself, even as the first meal went out, the preparation for the next one was already quietly beginning. More wood was laid on the fire. More water was brought from the well in the yard. The wooden bucket set down with a satisfying hollow sound on the stone floor. Someone swept the hearth clear of ash with a bundle of twigs bound together, the ash falling soft and gray into a metal pan to be carried out later and used in the garden or for making lye for cleaning. The kitchen turned itself over, as it did every morning, as it had done every morning for as long as anyone could remember, without drama, without ceremony, simply doing what it had always done. There is something deeply restful about a place that knows its own purpose so completely. The castle kitchen in the early morning was exactly what it needed to be. Warm, busy in a quiet way, smelling of bread and fire and herbs, its rhythms as reliable as the turning of the seasons, its work as old and as necessary as hunger itself. The stones of the floor held the warmth of 10,000 mornings just like this one, and the smoke had darkened the ceiling beams over decades and decades of fires just like these. And the wooden spoon moving through the pottage was following a path worn smooth by all the hands that had stirred before it. The morning settled into itself, comfortable and sure, and from the kitchen, warmth moved outward through the castle, carried in the bread and in the broth and in the simple, steady fact that people had been fed and would be fed again, that the fire would be kept and the bread would be baked, that tomorrow morning someone would come again to the banked embers and coax them gently back to life, and the kitchen would breathe in and begin its day once more, as it always had, as it always would, in the long and quiet life of the castle, going about its ordinary work. And so the morning settled into itself, the way mornings do when there is much to be done and no particular hurry about doing it. The castle had woken gradually, in layers, the way a large and comfortable thing wakes. First the kitchens, then the stables, then the upper rooms where the household began to stir beneath their woolen blankets. And now, as the light grew stronger and the dew began to lift from the stones of the courtyard, the great hall was coming to life in its own unhurried way. The great hall was the heart of the castle, the room to which everything else referred. If you were to stand at its threshold in the middle of a working morning, you would understand immediately why that word. Heart is the right one. There was a warmth to it, even on cool days, that came not only from the fire burning in the central hearth, but from something harder to name. Something to do with the way the room held people. The way its high timber ceiling gathered the sounds of voices and the scrape of benches and the soft thud of a log being added to the flames, and kept them close the way cupped hands hold water. The hall was long, long enough that the far end, where the Lord's table stood on its raised dais, seemed in certain lights to be a different room entirely. a quieter and more deliberate place than the busy middle of the floor where the household ate and worked and gathered. The walls were thick stone, and in winter they held the cold. But the tapestries helped with that. Great woven hangings in colors that had once been vivid and had softened now with years into something even more pleasing. A kind of dusty rose and faded blue and the warm ochre of old honey. They moved very slightly in the drafts that found their way through the high, narrow windows. And watching them was a little like watching something breathe. The floor was strewn with rushes. This is something worth pausing on for a moment, because it sounds simple, and it was, in a way, but it was also a whole small world underfoot. Fresh rushes were sweet-smelling, clean and pale, almost like dried grass on a summer afternoon, and they were laid down regularly. The old ones swept out and the new ones scattered in their place. Mixed into the rushes were herbs, lavender sometimes, or meadowsweet, or the sharp, clean scent of wormwood. And when feet moved across them through the day, the herbs released their fragrance in small, quiet bursts, so that the hall smelled always of something growing, something green even in the depths of January when the world outside was gray and still. The trestle tables were being set up now. This was a daily ritual, unhurried and familiar, performed by the same hands in the same order. And there was something deeply satisfying about watching it if you had the time to watch. The tables themselves were not fixed to the floor. They were boards laid across wooden supports, and they could be taken down again after meals to clear the space for other uses. And this flexibility was part of what made the hall so useful, so alive to different purposes at different hours. The servants who set them up moved with the ease of long practice, lifting the boards into place with a soft wooden knock, smoothing the linen cloths over them with broad, flat strokes of the hand, setting out the salt cellars and the bread trenchers and the wooden cups in their accustomed places. The salt cellar deserves a moment of attention, because in the hall it was not merely a container for salt. It was a marker, a gentle boundary. The great salt cellar, usually a handsome thing, made of silver or pewter, sometimes shaped like a ship or a small tower, sat on the high table, and its position told you something about the order of the room. Those who sat above the salt, near the Lord's table, were of higher rank. Those below it were of the household proper, the servants and the craftspeople and the visitors of lesser standing. It was not a harsh division. Everyone ate in the same room, breathed the same air, heard the same conversations. But it was a real one, and the salt cellar sat at its center with a quiet authority, catching the firelight on its polished sides. By mid-morning, the hall had taken on the particular quality of a room that is waiting, pleasantly for something it knows is coming. The fire had been built up and was burning well, sending its warmth out across the rushes in slow, invisible waves. The smell of the morning's bread drifted in from the kitchens, a rich, yeasty smell, dense and comforting. The smell of flour and heat and something almost sweet. And it mingled with the wood smoke and the herbs on the floor and the faint cold stone smell that never entirely left the walls. And the result was the smell of the hall itself, its own particular atmosphere, the way every large room that is well used develops a smell that belongs to no single thing but to all of them together. People moved through the hall on their way to other places. A steward with a roll of parchment under his arm, walking briskly but not urgently toward the far end. A young boy carrying a bundle of kindling, watching his own feet with great concentration. Two women pausing near the hearth to exchange a few words, their voices low and comfortable, not quite audible from across the room, but present as a soft murmur beneath the other sounds. A dog, there were always dogs in the hall, making its way along the wall with the patient, purposeful air of a dog that has somewhere specific in mind, though it is difficult to say where. The high table at the far end stood a little apart from all of this. It was raised on a low platform, just a step or two above the level of the main floor, and this small elevation gave it a different quality of light. The windows were higher there, and the light came in at a cleaner angle, falling across the table in long pale rectangles that shifted slowly as the morning progressed. The Lord's chair was there, a solid and well-made thing with arms and a high back, cushioned with a piece of embroidered cloth. On either side of it were benches, also cushioned for the members of the household who would sit closest to the Lord at meals. The table itself was covered with a finer cloth than the others, white linen that had been bleached and pressed, and the cups and plates set upon it were of better quality. Not extravagant necessarily, but carefully chosen, cared for, polished to a quiet shine. Meals in the great hall were not simply occasions for eating. They were the moments when the household gathered itself, when the day's work paused and the community of the castle became visible to itself. The midday meal, dinner as it was called, the main meal of the day, would bring together people from every part of the castle's life. The Lord and his family, the steward and the chaplain, the knights and the senior servants, the craftspeople who had been working since dawn in the workshops and the yard. They would come in from their separate labors and find their places at the tables. And for a time the hall would be full of the sound of many people eating and talking at once. A sound that was not quite noise, but more like weather. Present, surrounding, comfortable. The food arrived from the kitchens in a procession of dishes carried by servants who moved carefully and with a certain dignity, aware that the serving of food was itself a skilled and considered thing. There would be pottage, a thick, slow-cooked stew of vegetables and grains and whatever else was available, warming and substantial, with a smell that was earthy and rich and deeply familiar. There would be bread, of course. Always bread, the trenchers that served as plates as well as food, soaking up the juices of whatever was placed upon them. There would be roasted meat on feast days and simpler things on ordinary ones. Salted fish, perhaps, or eggs, or a dish of beans cooked with herbs until they were soft and fragrant. The food was honest and filling and made with the knowledge that the people eating it had been working since early morning and would go on working until dark. At the high table, the meal was served with a little more ceremony. A carver stood to one side and cut the meat with practiced strokes, and the Lord's cup was kept filled by a young page who stood at his shoulder with the quiet attentiveness of someone learning a skill by watching it closely. The chaplain might say a blessing at the start, a few words in Latin spoken without haste, the familiar syllables falling into the room like stones into still water, settling everything a little, marking the moment as one worth pausing for. And there was music sometimes. Not always, but often enough that the expectation of it was part of the hall's atmosphere. A harper in the corner, playing something gentle and unhurried. the notes rising and falling with the ease of water finding its level. Or a single voice unaccompanied, singing something old, a song about a season. Or a journey or a place that everyone in the room had never been but somehow recognized. The music did not demand attention. It was simply there the way the fire was there, the way the smell of the herbs was there, woven into the texture of the afternoon without insisting on itself. After the meal, the tables might be cleared and the hall would shift its purpose again. This was one of the things that made the great hall so central to the life of the castle. It was never just one thing for very long. In the afternoon, it might become a place of business. The lord sitting in his chair at the high table while the steward read accounts aloud. The scratch of a quill on parchment keeping a quiet rhythm beneath their voices. Or it might become a workroom. The women of the household gathering near the best light of the windows with their embroidery frames and their spindles. Working with the particular focused calm of people doing something with their hands that they have done many times before and will do many times again. Children moved through the hall with a freedom that was understood and accepted. A castle was not a quiet place for children. There was too much to see, too many people moving through, too many interesting corners and doorways and staircases leading to other parts of the building. But the hall was where they returned, the way children return to whatever room their family gathers in. They might sit near the fire with a lesson, a tutor patient beside them, the Latin letters forming slowly on a wax tablet. They might chase the dogs, or watch the servants at their work with the wide-eyed attention of children who are learning, without knowing they are learning, what it means to run a large and complicated household. As the afternoon light began to change, deepening, softening, the pale rectangles on the high table floor shifting toward gold, the hall settled into an evening mood. Torches were lit in their iron brackets on the walls, and the quality of the light became warmer and more flickering, less clear than the daylight had been, but somehow more intimate, more suited to the quieter rhythms of the later hours. The fire was built up again, and the smell of fresh wood on hot embers joined the other smells of the room, something resinous and clean and very old. The supper would come smaller than dinner, simpler, the last gathering of the household before the night. People ate more quietly in the evening, the day's energy beginning to ease, voices dropping a little, the laughter softer. The dogs settled near the fire in the particular boneless way of dogs that have decided the day is over. The harper, if he was there, played something slower, the notes more widely spaced, as though the music itself was breathing more deeply. And when the meal was done and the last of the cups had been set down, when the fire had been banked for the night and the torches one by one had been put out, the great hall became something different again, a large and quiet space in the dark, holding the warmth of the day's fire in its stones, the smell of the day's food in its rushes. The faint memory of all the voices that had filled it still present somewhere in its high-shadowed ceiling. It was a room that asked nothing of the night but to be left in peace, and the night was glad to oblige. The rushes lay still on the floor. The tapestries hung without moving. The salt cellar on the high table caught some small reflection of the dying fire and held it. A last quiet gleam as the hall breathed slowly in the dark and rested, as it had rested every night for as long as anyone could remember. gathering itself for the morning that would come again and fill it once more with warmth and voices and the smell of bread, and all the gentle, ordinary business of a household going about its day. Beyond the hall, in the deeper parts of the castle, other rooms were settling into their own night quiet, each with its own particular character, its own way of holding the darkness. And it is to those quieter, more private spaces that we will find our way next, following the last of the candlelight up the worn stone stairs. And so we find ourselves moving through those upper corridors, where the stone underfoot has been smoothed by generations of careful footsteps, and the air carries the faint smell of tallow and old parchment, a smell that is neither quite pleasant nor unpleasant, but simply the smell of work being done quietly and with great attention. It is a particular kind of work that waits for us here. The work of keeping count, of remembering, of setting down in careful ink what the world has done today and what it will need to do tomorrow. Every castle, no matter how grand its great hall or how deep its cellars, ran on something far less visible than stone or timber. It ran on numbers, not cold or frightening numbers, but the gentle, necessary kind. How many bushels of wheat came in from the eastern fields this week? How many candles were drawn from the store? How many loaves were baked and distributed? How much salt remained in the barrel near the kitchen door? Someone had to hold all of this in their mind, or better yet, on a page. And that someone was the steward. The steward was, in many ways, the quiet heart of the whole household. Not its most powerful figure, and certainly not its most celebrated, but perhaps its most essential. Imagine him, and it was most often a him, though not always, moving through the castle in the early morning, when the cooks were just beginning to stoke the kitchen fires, and the smell of wood smoke was drifting up through the interior passages, soft and gray as a winter morning. He would have walked with the particular unhurried purpose of a person who knows exactly what needs doing and has already begun doing it in his head before his feet have carried him there. He might have started in the kitchens, exchanging a few quiet words with the head cook about what provisions would be needed for the day. Listening carefully, nodding, making a small note on the wax tablet he carried tucked under one arm. The wax tablet was a practical thing, worn smooth at the edges from years of handling, and it allowed him to make temporary marks that could be smoothed away and written over again. A kind of daily memory that did not need to last beyond the evening. What needed to last would be transferred later, in the calmer hours after the midday meal, onto parchment in ink that would dry slowly and hold its shape for years. The steward's authority spread through the castle the way warmth spreads from a hearth, gradually, without announcement, reaching into every corner. He oversaw the pantler, who was responsible for the bread in the pantry, that cool, dim room where loaves were stacked on wooden shelves and the air always held the faint sweetness of flour. He worked alongside the butler, whose name came from the French word for bottle, and who was responsible for the wine and ale, keeping careful track of what was drawn from the barrels and what remained, because a castle's supply of drink was a serious matter of daily comfort and hospitality. He kept an eye on the marshal, who managed the stables, and on the chamberlain, who looked after the lord's private rooms and personal needs. All of these people reported, in their various ways, to the steward, and the steward reported to the lord. It was a chain of quiet accountability, each link depending on the next. And it worked because everyone in it understood their role and took it seriously. Not out of fear, but out of something closer to professional pride. The satisfaction of a thing done well in a household running smoothly. But the steward did not work alone in the world of accounts and record keeping. Alongside him, and sometimes working in a small room just off the great hall or tucked into a corner of the upper floor, were the clerks. These were men who had been educated, usually by the church, in the arts of reading and writing and basic calculation. And they brought to the castle a particular kind of quiet usefulness. Their hands were often stained with ink, a pale blue-gray at the fingertips that never quite washed away. And they sat for long hours at slanted writing desks, the parchment held flat by a small weight, a candle burning close enough to see by, but not so close as to risk the page. The writing itself was a slow and careful process. A good clerk took pride in his hand, in the evenness of his letters and the neatness of his columns. And there was a kind of meditative quality to the work. The scratch of the quill, the slight resistance of the parchment, the need to pause and dip and blow gently on a freshly written line to help it dry. The room where clerks worked would have smelled of ink and parchment, and perhaps a little of the beeswax used to seal letters. A warm, faintly honeyed smell that mingled with the ever-present wood smoke from the small brazier kept burning in winter to keep the ink from thickening in the cold. The documents they produced were called accounts, and they covered everything. There were household accounts that tracked the daily expenditure of food and fuel and candles. There were estate accounts that recorded the rents paid by the tenants who farmed the land belonging to the castle. Rents that might be paid in coin, or in grain, or in days of labor, or in a combination of all three. There were accounts of building work, listing the wages paid to masons and carpenters and thatchers who came to repair or extend the castle structures. There were records of purchases made at market, of gifts given and received, of debts owed and debts settled. These documents were not merely bureaucratic. They were, in a very real sense, a kind of memory, a way of holding the life of the castle still for long enough to examine it, to understand where things were going well and where adjustments might be needed. When a lord sat down with his steward in the evening to review the week's accounts, it was not an anxious or fraught occasion, but a practical one. A quiet conversation between two people who both wanted the same thing, which was for the household to continue running smoothly, for the stores to hold through winter, for the tenants to be fairly treated and the debts to be manageable. The accounting year in a medieval castle often followed the rhythm of the church calendar, with certain feast days serving as natural moments of reckoning. Michaelmas, falling in late September, was particularly important, a time when the harvest was in and the summer's work could be measured and counted. When rents came due and the steward could sit with his tallies and his parchment and draw a kind of line under the year just past. The tally stick was another tool of this world, a simple piece of wood onto which notches were cut to record a transaction, then split down the middle so that both parties held a matching half. A record that could not be falsified because the two halves had to fit together perfectly. These sticks were bundled and stored, a physical archive of promises made and kept. There is something quietly beautiful about the tally stick, if you let yourself think about it. The idea that a piece of wood, cut from a hedgerow or a coppice, could carry the memory of an agreement between two people, that the grain of the wood itself was part of the record. The notches were cut in different sizes to represent different amounts, and a person who knew how to read them could hold a bundle of these sticks and understand, in a few minutes, the entire financial history of a relationship between a lord and a tenant stretching back years. The clerks also wrote letters, and this was another important part of their daily work. A castle was not an isolated thing, but a node in a web of relationships, with other noble families, with the church, with merchants, with the king's administration. Letters went out regularly, carried by messengers who were themselves a small but important part of the household. Young men who knew the roads and could be trusted to deliver a sealed document without reading it or losing it. The letters were written in Latin or in the vernacular, depending on their purpose and their recipient, and they were sealed with wax impressed with the Lord's seal, a small carved stone or metal device that left a distinctive impression, a signature that could not easily be forged. The preparation of a letter was a small ceremony in itself. The clerk would prepare the parchment, trimming it to the right size with a small knife, smoothing any rough patches with a pumice stone. He would mix or warm his ink, test his quill, and then write carefully, leaving space at the bottom for the seal. When the letter was finished and dry, it would be folded and a small pool of wax dripped onto the fold, and the seal pressed into it firmly and held for a moment while the wax hardened. There was a particular satisfaction in that moment. The brief pressure, the slight resistance, and then the lifting away of the seal to reveal the impression clean and sharp in the cooling wax. Beyond the accounts and the letters, the steward and his clerks were also involved in the management of the castle's relationship with the land around it. The villages and farms that belonged to the estate were not distant abstractions, but living places full of people whose well-being was bound up with the castle's management. The steward might ride out several times a week to visit the home farm, where the castle's own crops were grown and its animals kept, checking on the progress of the plowing or the state of the fences, talking with the reeve, who was the village's own elected manager and the link between the farming community and the castle administration. These were not grand journeys, but quiet, practical ones, the steward on a steady horse, the field stretching out around him in whatever season it happened to be, the smell of turned earth in spring or ripe grain in late summer or cold mud in the gray weeks of November. He would return to the castle in the early afternoon with a head full of observations and perhaps a few notes on his wax tablet. And he would sit down with a clerk and work through what needed to be recorded or acted upon. The relationship between the steward and the clerks was a close and usually comfortable one, built on daily proximity and shared purpose. They ate together in the hall, sat near one another in the hierarchy of the household table, and spent long hours in the same small rooms. A good steward valued a good clerk enormously, because a clerk who wrote clearly and accurately and could be trusted to copy a document without error was genuinely difficult to replace. Clerks, for their part, often found in the castle household a stable and not uncomfortable life, with regular meals, a roof overhead, and work that engaged their minds without requiring them to stand in the cold or lift heavy things. There were moments of lightness in this world of accounts and correspondence. A clerk might spend a few minutes at the end of a long page decorating the margin with a small drawing. A leaf, a bird, a face. Not because anyone asked him to, but because his hand was tired of letters and wanted to make something else for a moment. These small drawings survive in some of the account rolls that have come down to us, tucked into the edges of columns of figures. Tiny and unannounced, a brief holiday from the serious business of record keeping. They are among the most touching things that remain from this world. Evidence of a person sitting at a desk on an ordinary afternoon, tired and perhaps a little bored, letting their mind wander for just a moment before returning to the work. The day for the steward and his clerks did not end sharply, but wound down gradually, the way a fire winds down when it is not fed new wood. The afternoon's work of copying and calculating would give way, in the early evening, to a final review of the day's tallies, a quiet conversation with the pantler about tomorrow's provisions, a last walk through the great hall to see that everything was in order before the household gathered for the evening meal. The clerks would clean their quills and cap their ink and roll the day's parchment carefully, tying it with a strip of leather and setting it in its proper place in the chest or cupboard where the records were kept. That chest, or those chests, were themselves a kind of treasure, not because of their contents' monetary value, but because of what they represented: the accumulated memory of the household, year upon year of careful observation and faithful recording. A castle that kept good records was a castle that understood itself, that could plan ahead and learn from the past, that treated its people and its land with a kind of sustained, unhurried attention. The records were the proof of that attention, set down in ink that had long since dried to a soft brown on pages that had grown supple and slightly translucent with age. And as the evening settled over the castle, as the smell of the kitchen fires gave way to the smell of the great hall laid for supper, as the candles were lit one by one along the tables, and the household began to gather in from its various corners and occupations, the steward would take his place with the quiet satisfaction of a person who has done what needed doing. The accounts were in order. The stores were counted, the letters were sealed and ready for the morning messenger. The day had been held, carefully and without fuss, in the net of all that careful record-keeping. And tomorrow would be held just the same way. It is a kind of peace, really, to think of it. All that patient attention, all those careful marks on parchment and wood, all those quiet conversations about grain and candles and rent. The castle breathed through its accounts the way a person breathes in sleep, steadily and without effort, sustaining itself from one season to the next. And from those rooms of parchment and ink, we will move now toward the parts of the castle where the work was less of the mind and more of the hands, where the smells were stronger and the sounds were warmer, and where a different kind of daily life was unfolding in the heat and the noise and the good productive bustle of the kitchens. And if you followed the warmth of the kitchens outward, past the last stone archway and across the inner courtyard, where the morning light lay in long pale strips across the cobbles, you would find yourself drawn toward a different kind of warmth altogether. Not the warmth of fire and rendered fat in bubbling pots, but the warmth of living bodies, of breath and hay and the particular deep animal heat that gathers in a stable on a cool autumn morning. It was a gentler warmth, somehow a quieter one, the sort that settles into your shoulders and makes you want to slow down, to move more carefully, to lower your voice without quite knowing why. The stables in a great medieval castle were not a single building so much as a whole small world tucked against the outer wall, where the stones were thick and the roof was low and the air smelled of dried grass and leather, and something warm and faintly sweet that you would recognize immediately if you have ever spent time near horses. There would be the soft percussion of hooves shifting on packed earth, the occasional long exhale of a horse settling into its hay, the creak of a wooden partition as an animal leaned its weight against it. These were the sounds of contentment, really of creatures well tended and at ease in their familiar surroundings. The horses of a medieval castle were not all the same. And understanding that helps you understand something about how the castle itself was organized. There were the great destriers, the heavy warhorses kept in their own wider stalls with extra bedding and a kind of careful attention that bordered on reverence. These animals were enormously valuable, more valuable in practical terms than most of the people who tended them. And they were handled only by those who knew them well, who had spent months and years learning the particular habits and moods of each individual horse. A destrier might stand 17 hands high, its coat dark and gleaming, its breath coming in slow clouds in the cool morning air. And the groom who brought it its morning feed would speak to it in a low murmur. Not quite words, just sound. The way you might speak to someone you have known so long that language has become almost unnecessary. Then there were the palfreys, the riding horses used for travel and ceremony. Smoother gaited, more refined, bred for the long, comfortable miles of a journey rather than the short, explosive power needed elsewhere. A noblewoman might have a palfrey of her own, a particular animal she had ridden for years, and the bond between them would be one of the quiet, ongoing relationships that made up so much of castle life. Not dramatic, not celebrated, just steady and real and renewed every morning when the groom brought the horse its water and the animal turned its head toward the sound of familiar footsteps. And then there were the working horses, the roundseys and the cart horses, the sturdy, broad-backed animals that pulled the wagons and carried the supplies and did the slow, reliable work of keeping everything moving. They were not glamorous, they were not the subject of songs, but they were perhaps the most essential animals in the whole establishment, and the people who tended them knew it, even if no one else seemed to. The head groom, sometimes called the marshal's man, sometimes simply the master of horse, would have been at work since before the light was fully up. His day began in the dark, or near enough to it, with a lantern hung on a hook by the stable door and the horses already stirring in their stalls, aware of the approaching morning in the way that animals always seem to be, as though they carry some interior clock more reliable than any bell. He would move through the stables slowly, checking each animal in turn, running a hand along a flank, checking a hoof, looking at the eyes, noting whether an animal had eaten well or left feed untouched overnight. This was not a dramatic process. It was quiet and methodical and deeply familiar. The same circuit walked every morning for years, until the groom knew each animal's normal state so well that any small deviation would register immediately. Like a note played slightly off-key in a song you have heard 1,000 times. Imagine the smell of it, the deep, sweet dustiness of hay, the leather of the bridles hanging on their pegs, the faint mineral smell of the stone walls, the warm animal scent that is not unpleasant at all, but is instead oddly comforting. The smell of something alive and cared for and settled in its place. The stable boys, some of them very young, 8 or 9 years old, beginning their long apprenticeship in the management of horses, would be mucking out the stalls, forking old bedding into a barrow, spreading fresh straw in thick pale layers across the floor. It was physical work and not delicate work, but it was done with a kind of practiced ease. The boys moving around the horses with confidence, ducking under necks and stepping past hindquarters with the casual assurance of children who have grown up in this environment and long since stopped being afraid. The feeding itself was a careful business. Different horses needed different amounts, different mixtures of hay and grain, and occasionally something extra. A handful of dried herbs, a measure of bran mash on a cold morning. A particular supplement that the head groom had decided was good for an animal that had been working hard. The grain was kept in wooden bins with heavy lids to keep out the rats, and the hay was stored in a loft above the stalls where it stayed dry and sweet-smelling, dropping down through gaps in the boards in soft golden falls when the boys pulled it loose. The horses would hear the grain being measured and would begin to shift and nose at their stall doors. And there was something endearing about it. These enormous, powerful animals, reduced by the prospect of breakfast to the same simple eagerness as any other creature. Water was carried in wooden buckets from the well in the yard, and this was one of the less loved tasks of the stable boys. The long, cold trips back and forth across the cobbles on a winter morning, the buckets heavy and the water slopping over the edges onto already cold hands. But the horses drank deeply and gratefully, and there was something satisfying in that, in the long sound of an animal drinking its fill, the bucket tilting as the level dropped, the horse lifting its head at last with water dripping from its muzzle, looking briefly content with the world. Grooming came after feeding, and this was perhaps the most intimate part of the stable day. A good groom would spend a long time with each horse, working through the coat with a wooden curry comb in slow, circular motions, then following with a softer brush, then a cloth until the coat lay flat and gleaming. The mane and tail were combed through carefully, the hooves picked out with an iron hook, the legs checked for any heat or swelling that might indicate a problem developing. The horses seemed to enjoy this, leaning slightly into the pressure of the brush, dropping their heads, half closing their eyes in an expression of drowsy satisfaction. It was easy to spend time in the stables, if you had the temperament for it. The work was absorbing in a quiet way, and the company was undemanding, and the rhythm of it, the long, slow strokes of the brush, the soft sounds of the horses, the particular quality of the light coming in through the stable doors, had a way of making the rest of the world feel very far away. Beyond the stables, connected to them by a short covered passageway that smelled of damp stone and old rope, lay the mews, and here the atmosphere shifted again, becoming something stranger and more hushed. The way a library feels different from a kitchen, even when both are full of purposeful activity. The mews was where the hawks were kept, and it was a place that demanded a particular kind of quiet, a particular kind of stillness, because the birds were sensitive to noise and movement in ways that the horses, for all their size and power, were not. Falconry was one of the great pursuits of medieval noble life, and the hawks and falcons that lived in the castle mews were among its most prized possessions. A peregrine falcon, well-trained and in good condition, was worth an extraordinary amount, not just in money but in status, in the kind of quiet prestige that came from owning something beautiful and rare and difficult to manage. The birds perched on wooden blocks or on padded perches along the wall, their feet secured by thin leather straps called jesses, their heads sometimes covered by small fitted leather hoods that kept them calm in the way that darkness calms many creatures. The hoods were beautiful objects in themselves. Tooled leather sometimes dyed in colors, sometimes decorated with a small plume on top. And the falconer who made and fitted them took pride in their construction the way any craftsman takes pride in a tool that is both functional and lovely. The falconer was a specialist, a person of some standing in the castle hierarchy, and his knowledge was deep and particular and accumulated over many years. He knew each bird individually, its temperament, its preferences, its particular way of responding to handling, the subtle signs that indicated whether it was in good health and good humor or whether something was slightly off. The birds had names, of course. They always had names, and the falconer used them constantly, speaking to the birds in a low, even voice as he moved among them, carrying a small piece of meat on his gloved fist, letting each bird step up onto the glove and take its reward, maintaining the relationship of trust and familiarity that made the whole enterprise possible. The morning routine in the mews was careful and slow. The birds needed to be fed, but not too much. A hawk that was too full had no interest in flying. And the whole point of the training was to maintain a precise balance between hunger and contentment that kept the bird alert and responsive without making it anxious or difficult. The falconer knew this balance intuitively, the way a good cook knows when a sauce is right without measuring anything. He would weigh a bird in his hands, feeling its keel bone through the feathers, judging its condition by a kind of practiced touch that was almost impossible to describe to someone who had not spent years developing it. The birds were also carried, taken out of the mews on the falconer's fist and walked slowly around the yard, accustoming them to the sounds and movements of the castle, keeping them calm and manageable and used to the presence of people and horses and dogs. This was called manning, and it was one of the most time-consuming parts of the falconer's work, requiring patience of a very particular kind. The patience of someone who understands that you cannot hurry an animal's trust, that it accumulates in small increments over many quiet hours, and that any shortcut will cost you more time in the end than you saved. The falconer walking his hawk through the castle yard in the morning light, the bird sitting still and alert on his gloved fist, its bright eye taking in everything. This was a common sight, unremarkable to those who saw it every day. And yet there was something in it that was quietly extraordinary. This partnership between a person and a wild creature, built on nothing but time and gentleness and the slow accumulation of small moments of trust. The dogs, too, had their place in this world. The hunting hounds kept in their own kennels near the stables, their voices sometimes rising in a brief chorus when something interesting passed by, then settling again into the low, comfortable sounds of animals at rest. The kennel master tended them with the same methodical care that the head groom brought to the horses and the falconer brought to his birds. The same morning rounds, the same attentiveness to each individual animal, the same quiet expertise built up over years of close attention. These were working animals, all of them, with roles to play in the life of the castle and in the hunting that was both sport and a practical source of food. But they were also simply creatures that people had grown fond of, that had particular personalities and histories and places in the daily life of the household. By mid-morning, the busiest part of the stable day was usually done. The horses had been fed and watered and groomed. The hawks had been fed and handled and carried. The kennels had been cleaned and the dogs settled. The stable boys were sweeping the yard with long-handled brooms. The sound of bristles on cobblestones a soft, rhythmic accompaniment to the rest of the morning's sounds. The head groom might be sitting on a low stool near the stable door, repairing a piece of harness, the careful work of his needle pushing through thick leather, the thread pulled taut with each stitch, the whole thing done with the unhurried concentration of someone who does not need to think about what his hands are doing anymore. The light in the stable yard at mid-morning was soft and clear, coming over the top of the outer wall in a way that caught the dust motes rising from the hay and made them drift and turn like slow golden snow. The horses stood quiet in their stalls. The hawks sat still on their perches in the dim coolness of the mews, their eyes half closed, their feathers slightly fluffed against the chill. The dogs lay curled in their kennels, dreaming whatever dogs dream, and the people who tended all of these creatures moved among them with the easy familiarity of long habit, each one absorbed in their particular task, each one part of the same slow and steady rhythm that kept this corner of the castle world turning quietly from one day to the next. It was a world unto itself, this world of animals and the people who knew them, separate in its pace and its atmosphere from the great hall above and the kitchens behind, and yet connected to everything. The horses that would carry riders out across the fields, the hawks that would rise into the pale autumn sky, the whole living web of the castle reaching outward from its stones into the wider world beyond its walls. And so the castle reached outward, and the world reached back, and somewhere in the middle of all that quiet exchange, life simply continued as it always had, in its steady and unhurried way. There was a yard, of course. Every castle had one or several, depending on how the walls had grown over the years, how one generation had added a tower here and a lean-to there, how the whole place had slowly accumulated itself like a stone creature settling more deeply into the earth. The training yard was usually tucked somewhere practical, not the grand inner courtyard where visitors might arrive on horseback and need to feel impressed, but somewhere a little further along, a little more worn at the edges, where the ground had been packed hard by years and years of feet moving in the same patterns. The grass, if there had ever been grass, had long since given up. What remained was earth, pale and dusty in dry weather, soft and dark after rain, and always faintly marked with the shapes of where people had stood and turned and stepped and stood again. On a cool morning in autumn, the light came into that yard at a low angle, long and golden, the kind of light that makes even plain things look as though they have been considered carefully. The stones of the surrounding walls caught it on one side and held it, warm and amber, while the other side remained in shadow that was almost blue. Somewhere nearby there would have been the smell of the stables, that familiar animal warmth, and underneath it the faint sharpness of the smithy if the forge had already been lit, and underneath that always the smell of the earth itself. The young men who came to train here came early, not because anyone had told them that early rising was a virtue, though certainly someone had, but because the work of the morning was long and the day did not wait. A squire, a young man perhaps 14 or 15 years old, perhaps a little older, who had been placed in the household of a knight or a lord to learn the craft of his future life. would have been up before the yard was fully light. He would have helped with the horses first, because the horses always came first, and there was a whole quiet education in that alone. How to move around a large animal without startling it. How to read the small signs of mood in the angle of an ear. The shifting of weight from one foot to another. How to work steadily and without fuss, because fuss solved nothing and the horse knew the difference. By the time the yard was properly lit, the real work of the morning would begin. Imagine the sound of it, not the clash and ring of a tournament. Nothing so grand as that, but the steady, repetitive thud of wooden practice weapons against a post, or against a padded target, or against another wooden weapon held by someone who was also learning. There was a post called, in various places and times, a pell, a simple upright stake of wood, thick enough to take a blow without splitting, worn smooth and slightly hollowed on one side where 1,000 blows had landed. A young man would stand before it and swing again, and the sound was a dull, honest thud over and over, until the pattern of the movement began to settle into the body rather than the mind. This was the heart of it, really not the drama of any particular moment, but the slow, patient accumulation of a skill that lived in the muscles and the bones. A knight in full armor, moving with the particular economy of someone who had done this for 20 years, was not thinking about where to place his feet. He had stopped thinking about that long ago. The thinking had been done in yards like this one, on mornings like this one, until it was no longer thought but simply motion, as natural as walking, and walking, after all, is something no one remembers learning. The knights and men-at-arms who oversaw this training were not, for the most part, stern or frightening figures. They were more often men who had simply been doing this long enough to have opinions about it, and who expressed those opinions in the particular shorthand of people who spend a great deal of time together. A correction might come as a word, or as a hand placed briefly on a shoulder to adjust an angle, or simply as a demonstration. The older man picking up a weapon and showing the movement again, slowly so that the shape of it could be seen. There was a patience in this, a kind of craft transmission that was not so different from what was happening in the kitchens or the weaving rooms or the stables at the same hour. Each place passing its knowledge forward through the same slow and careful means. The equipment itself had a particular weight and presence. A practice sword made of wood was heavier than you might expect, because it needed to be. Because swinging something lighter would teach the arms the wrong lesson, and the arms would remember. Real swords were heavy, and the body needed to know that. Needed to build itself around that knowledge over years. A young squire's arms in his first season of training would ache by mid-morning in a way that faded, slowly over months, until one day he would realize the ache had not come. And that would be a small, quiet milestone that no one celebrated except perhaps himself, privately in the moment before sleep. There were other things learned in the yard besides the work with weapons. Riding, of course, though the riding lessons often happened in a slightly different space, a wider area where a horse could move properly. But the relationship between a rider and a horse was woven through everything, because a mounted warrior who could not manage his horse was not much use to anyone, and managing a horse in difficult circumstances was not something that could be explained. It had to be felt, again and again, until the adjustments became automatic. The way to sit when the animal moved suddenly beneath you. The way to keep your seat without gripping so hard that you communicated your own tension back into the creature. These were lessons that took years, and the horses were patient teachers in their way, though entirely indifferent to the feelings of the student. There was also wrestling, which sounds rougher than it was in practice. Or rather, it was rough, but in the ordinary way of physical work, not in any alarming way. Learning to fall without being hurt was a skill as important as any other. Because falling happened, and the difference between a fall that ended a day and a fall that ended nothing much at all was largely a matter of knowing how to manage the ground when it came up to meet you. Young men practiced this on the packed earth of the yard, and in winter sometimes on ground that was harder still. And they learned, and they got up, and they went back to it. The older men who watched all of this, the knights who had perhaps seen 30 or 40 years, which was a considerable age in that world, moved through the yard with a kind of settled authority that was not loud. They had learned what they knew in yards very much like this one, in other castles, in other seasons, and they carried that knowledge the way the walls carried the moss, quietly without announcement, as simply part of what they were. A young squire watching one of these men move, watching the eyes of it, the lack of wasted motion, might feel something that was not quite admiration and not quite longing, but some gentle combination of both. A sense of a long road ahead, and also a sense that the road was knowable, that it had been walked before and could be walked again. By mid-morning, the yard would be fuller, noisier in a low and steady way. Several pairs of men working at once, the wooden weapons making their rhythms against each other. Someone calling out a correction from across the space. The occasional pause while someone adjusted a grip or caught their breath or took a long drink of water from a clay cup that had been sitting on a low wall in the shade. The light by now had moved off the amber of early morning and settled into the clearer, cooler white of a proper autumn day. The shadows were shorter, somewhere above. A jackdaw or two might be circling the tower, their calls carrying down into the yard with that particular quality of sound that only birds achieve. Present and then absent, like a thought that drifts through and moves on. There were women sometimes who passed through or along the edges of the yard, going about their own work, carrying something from one part of the castle to another, or simply taking the most direct route between two places. They paid the training no particular attention, and the training paid them none, because this was ordinary life, and ordinary life does not stop to observe itself. A castle was a place where many different kinds of work happened in close proximity, and the people who lived there had long since stopped finding any of it remarkable. A squire's day in the yard was not all physical work. There was also, in the quieter parts of the morning, instruction in other things, the customs and courtesies that governed how a man of his rank was expected to behave, how to address different people, how to conduct himself at table, how to understand the basic obligations that tied one person to another in the web of relationships that held everything together. These lessons were less exciting than the weapons work, and the young men knew it, and the older men knew that they knew it, and the instruction happened anyway, in the patient way of things that are necessary regardless of how they are received. Imagine sitting on the low wall at the edge of the yard in the middle of the morning. The sun on your face, the smell of wood smoke drifting over from somewhere inside the walls, the sound of the work continuing around you, and someone older sitting beside you and talking. Not lecturing exactly, but talking in the way of someone who is trying to pass something along, to make sure it does not get lost. The knowledge of how things are done. The knowledge of what is expected. The slow, careful transmission of a whole way of being in the world. One conversation at a time. One morning at a time. Across years and years. By the time the yard began to quiet toward the middle of the day, the men drifting away to eat, the light settling into its full midday brightness overhead. There was a particular quality to the air in that space, a kind of used and satisfied feeling, as though the yard itself had been engaged in something and was now resting. The packed earth held the warmth of the sun. The practice weapons leaned against the wall where they had been left, their wood worn smooth and dark at the grip from years of handling. A dog which had been sleeping in a patch of sunlight along the far wall for most of the morning, stretched and resettled without waking. The young men who had been training carried the morning with them in their bodies. The warmth in the muscles, the particular tiredness that is not unpleasant, the kind that comes from having worked at something real. They would eat and rest a little, and the afternoon would bring its own tasks, its own small lessons, its own patient accumulation of the things that needed to be known. But for now, moving through the castle toward the smell of food, they were simply themselves young, and learning and part of the long, quiet story of a place that had been here before them and would be here long after. The yard, emptied, was peaceful. The jackdaws had settled, the light lay across the stones in long, soft plains, and in that stillness, it was easy to feel how this small space was connected to all the others. The kitchens and the hall, the stables and the storerooms, the garden and the gatehouse, each one doing its particular work, each one part of the same slow breath of a place that was, in the end, simply a home, and all the ordinary life that a home contains. From the yard, one might look up and see a window high in the wall of the great hall, and through it, if the light was right, the faintest glow of the fire that was kept burning there through the cooler months, and it would feel like nothing more than what it was. Warmth held inside stone, waiting for the people who would gather around it when the day's work was done. And so, as the afternoon light began its slow retreat from the high windows of the great hall, that warmth the castle had been holding all day long finally found its purpose. The stone walls, which had absorbed the pale winter sun through every narrow slit and courtyard opening since morning, now gave it back quietly. The way a river stone pulled from a stream bed still carries the heat of the day long after the sun has moved on. The hall itself seemed to breathe a little more slowly in these hours, as though it too understood that the working part of the day was drawing to a close, and something gentler was about to begin. The great hall of a medieval castle was many things at many hours. In the morning, it was a place of purposeful movement, of stewards with their wax tablets and servants carrying bread from the bakehouse. In the afternoon, it might serve as a counting room, a place of quiet instruction, or simply a corridor through which the life of the castle flowed. But in the evening, when the trestle tables were set up along its length and the torches were lit in their iron brackets along the walls. It became something else entirely. It became the heart of the household, the place where everyone gathered not because they had to, but because the gathering itself was the point. The preparation for supper began well before supper itself, and there was a particular pleasure in watching it unfold. The trestle tables were not fixed to the floor, but were exactly what their name suggested. Boards laid across supports, assembled fresh each evening and taken down again when the meal was done, so that the hall could be cleared for sleeping or other purposes. Setting them up was a task given to the younger servants, and they went about it with the particular energy of people who know that the work they are doing will soon reward them directly. The boards were wide and smooth, worn pale by years of use, and they were covered with linen cloths that had been aired and folded in the linen room, smelling faintly of the lavender and dried herbs that were kept among them to discourage moths. Imagine the smell of that linen as it was shaken out and laid flat, clean and slightly cool with that soft herbal note underneath. The smell of careful keeping, of someone having thought ahead. The cloth would settle over the board with a whisper, and the servants would smooth it with their hands, working from the center outward, the way you might smooth a blanket over a sleeping child. The high table, set on a raised platform at one end of the hall, received particular attention. This was where the lord and lady of the castle would sit, along with honored guests and the higher members of the household. The chaplain, perhaps, or visiting knights, or the steward when he was invited to join. The high table had its own finer cloth, sometimes embroidered at the edges, and the salt cellar was placed there with the kind of care you might give a small and valued piece of furniture. Salt was not precious in the way gold was precious, but it was important, and the salt cellar marked the boundary between those who sat near it and those who sat further down the hall. A gentle geography of rank that everyone understood without needing it explained. Candles were lit at the high table, thick tallow ones that burned with a warm amber light and a smell that was not entirely sweet but was familiar and domestic. The smell of evening in a stone building. The torches along the walls added their own rougher light, flickering when a door opened somewhere and sending shadows moving slowly across the tapestries. Those tapestries, if the castle was prosperous enough to have them, and many were, served a double purpose that was entirely practical and entirely beautiful at the same time. They kept the cold from the walls, and they gave the eyes something soft to rest on. Hunting scenes were common, full of green forests and running deer and hounds with their ears laid back, all rendered in wool dyed with plants. Weld for yellow, wode for blue, madder for the warm reds. In the torchlight the colors shifted slightly, the greens going darker, the reds warming toward orange, so that the scenes seemed almost to move. The kitchen, which was often a separate building, or at least a room with its own heavy doors to keep the fire risk away from the main hall, had been busy since mid-afternoon. The cook and the kitchen servants worked in a heat that was entirely unlike the gentle warmth of the hall. This was the working heat of open fires and brick ovens, the smell of roasting meat and browning pastry, and the sharp green smell of herbs being stripped from their stems and thrown into a pot. Rosemary, thyme, sage, marjoram, these were not luxuries but everyday ingredients, grown in the castle garden or dried and stored in the pantry in bunches that rustled dryly when you brushed past them. Supper in a medieval castle was not the grandest meal of the day. That was dinner served in the early afternoon. But it was the most social one. Dinner was often eaten in smaller groups or even privately. But supper brought the household together in the great hall in a way that felt deliberate, almost ceremonial, even when the occasion was entirely ordinary. There was a rhythm to it that the household knew without thinking. The steward would signal, the servants would begin to carry dishes from the kitchen, and the members of the household would find their places at the tables, settling onto the long benches with the particular ease of people who have done this same thing hundreds of times before. The food that came to the tables varied enormously depending on the season, the wealth of the household, and what the day had provided. In autumn there might be roasted birds, small ones caught by the falconers or larger ones from the castle's own dovecote, their skin browned and glistening. There might be a pottage, a thick, soft stew of vegetables and grains and whatever else was available, served in deep wooden bowls and eaten with bread that was dense and satisfying, the kind of bread that fills the hand before it fills the stomach. There might be cheese from the dairy, pale and mild, or a harder aged one that crumbled when you pressed it. There might be small pastries from the kitchen, their crusts pale gold, filled with spiced meat or dried fruit soaked in wine. The drink was ale mostly, brewed in the castle's own brewhouse from malted barley and water and a handful of herbs. It was not strong by any modern measure, but it was nourishing and it was warm in the body. And it tasted of the grain it was made from in a way that was earthy and honest. Wine appeared at the high table, brought up from the cellar in pottery jugs, poured carefully because it had come a long way and was not replaced easily. The smell of it, slightly sharp and a little sweet, drifted down the hall and mingled with everything else. The food, the candles, the wool of people's clothing, the rushes on the floor with their dried herbs crushed underfoot. And then, somewhere in the middle of the meal, or sometimes toward its end, when the serious business of eating had softened into something more relaxed, the music would begin. Music in a medieval castle was not a performance in the way we might think of it now. Something separate from ordinary life. Something you go to and then come home from. It was woven into the evening the way the firelight was woven into the evening. Present, expected, part of the texture of the thing. The musicians who served a great household were skilled and valued, but they were also simply there. Part of the daily life of the castle, the way the baker and the blacksmith were part of it. They ate at the lower tables. They had their own small room for storing their instruments. And they knew the preferences of the household the way a good cook knows what the family likes for breakfast. The instruments were beautiful objects in themselves, made with care from materials that were chosen as much for their sound as for their appearance. A lute might be made of fruit wood, its belly curved like a cupped hand, its strings of gut that had to be tuned carefully and often, especially near a fire where the warmth could pull them out of pitch. A harp might stand as tall as a child, its frame carved from a single piece of wood, its strings running in a clean diagonal line that caught the candlelight. There were smaller instruments too, a recorder or a flute cut from elder wood or bone, a small drum whose skin was stretched tight and thin, a stringed instrument played with a bow that made a sound like a human voice trying to become something more than words. The music that came from these instruments was not loud. It did not need to be. The hall was not so very large, and the sound carried in the stone space with a kind of softness. The notes rounding at their edges the way sound does in a room full of people and warm air and soft furnishings. The tunes were often familiar, melodies that the household had heard before, that had been passed from musician to musician not through written notes but through listening and memory, so that they carried in them a kind of accumulated warmth. The warmth of all the other evenings they had been played in all the other halls. Sometimes there was singing. A musician with a good voice might sing a song that told a story. Not a violent or a frightening one, but a long, wandering narrative about a journey or a love or a place far away. The kind of story that carries you along without requiring you to do very much except listen. The melody would repeat verse after verse, with slight variations, and the repetition was part of the pleasure. The way a rocking motion is part of the pleasure of being rocked. You knew where the tune was going, and you let it take you there, and then it went there again, and that was enough. The lord and lady at the high table might listen with their chins in their hands, or they might talk quietly to the person beside them. The music a gentle background to their conversation rather than the object of full attention. This was entirely acceptable. The music was not demanding attention. It was offering itself, and you could take as much or as little as you needed. Further down the hall, a group of younger household members might be listening more closely, or tapping a finger quietly on the table, or leaning together to share some quiet comment. Children who had been allowed to stay up for supper would be growing heavy-eyed by now, their heads nodding, their bowls pushed away, the music working on them the way music works on tired children, which is to say very effectively and very gently. The evening wore on without hurry. This was one of its defining qualities. The absence of urgency. The working day had its demands and its rhythms, its moments of necessary haste. But supper was not like that. The food came when it came. The music played when it played. Conversations began and ended and began again. Someone might bring out a game, a set of carved bone pieces for chess or tables. The board laid out on a corner of the table. The pieces moved with the particular quiet concentration that games bring. Someone else might be mending something by the light of a candle, their needle moving in and out of cloth with a small regular flash. The steward might be reviewing something in his memory, going over the accounts of the day, but even he would be doing it in a slower, less purposeful way than he had done it that morning. There was a word in medieval Latin, convivium, that meant something like a gathering for living together. A shared meal, a feast in the broad sense of the word. It carried in it the idea that eating together was not just about the food, but about the being together. The sharing of the same air and the same warmth and the same moment in time. The great hall at supper was a convivium in exactly this sense. The food was sustenance, but the gathering was something more than sustenance. It was the daily renewal of the household as a household. The moment when all the separate working parts of the castle's life came back together and recognized each other. As the evening deepened, the candles burned lower and the torches began to gutter. The musicians played more quietly, the tunes slowing almost imperceptibly. The notes held a little longer. The servants began to clear the last of the dishes, moving softly now, the clatter of the kitchen hours away. The trestle tables would soon be taken down, the boards stacked against the wall, the linen folded away. The hall would return to its nighttime self. Larger somehow without the tables. The floor clear, the fire settling into embers. But for now, in these last unhurried minutes of the evening, the hall held everything together one more time. The smell of the meal still lingered. Bread and herbs and the faint sweetness of the wine. And the music moved through it like something searching for a place to rest. The people at the tables were quieter now. The conversations softer, the laughter less frequent but no less warm. Children had been carried off to bed. The older members of the household sat with the particular stillness of people who are not quite ready to move, but know that they will. Soon, when the music ends and the fire goes down a little more. And the music, as if it understood all of this, found its way toward its ending without any sharp conclusion. The way a day finds its way toward evening. Not stopping exactly, but settling. The notes growing quieter and slower and softer until they were barely more than a memory of themselves. Still present in the warm stone air of the hall, still carrying the last of the day's warmth in their fading, like a hand held gently for a moment and then released. And so the warmth of the hall slowly found its edges, softened into something quieter, something that belonged more to the dark than to the day. The candles that had burned through the evening meal were mostly spent now. Their wax pooled in small pale lakes at the bases of iron holders, and the last few flames that remained stood very still in the absence of any draught, as though they too were thinking about sleep. The castle did not go dark all at once. It never did. There was a long, unhurried process to the ending of a day within those walls. A gradual dimming that moved from room to room the way a tide moves back from shore. Slow and inevitable and entirely without urgency. In the great hall, the trestle tables had been folded and leaned against the wall, and the rushes on the floor held the memory of the evening. The faint sweetness of the herbs that had been scattered among them. Lavender and meadowsweet, crushed now by the passage of many feet into something almost invisible. A fragrance more imagined than smelled, hovering just at the edge of notice. The kitchen fires, which had roared since before dawn, were being banked for the night. This was careful work, patient work, the kind of work that asks something quiet of the person doing it. A kitchen boy, perhaps 12 years old, would rake the coals into a close pile at the center of the hearth and cover them with a layer of ash, thick and even so that the heat would be preserved through the dark hours and the morning fire could be coaxed back to life without the long labor of starting from nothing. Imagine the smell of that kitchen at this hour. Wood smoke and rendered fat and the ghost of whatever had roasted on the spit. All of it settling into the stones of the wall the way scent settles into wool. Patient and permanent and entirely at home. The scullions who had scrubbed the pots would already be asleep in corners near the warmth, wrapped in rough woolen blankets, their breathing slow and deep before they had even fully arranged themselves. Children in a castle slept the way children have always slept when they have worked hard, completely without reservation, as though sleep were a country they had been waiting all day to return to. In the upper rooms, the household was finding its rest in stages. The lord and lady of the castle had retired earlier, attended by their personal servants, who helped them out of the layers of their formal dress, the heavy outer garments, the linen beneath. the soft shoes, and into the nightclothes that had been warming near a small brazier. The great bed in the Lord's chamber was a serious piece of furniture, curtained on all sides with thick fabric that could be drawn close to hold warmth and muffle sound. Inside those curtains, in the dark, the world became very small and very still. Just the weight of blankets and the sound of one's own breathing and the faint, distant impression of the castle continuing its life outside. Because the castle did not sleep entirely. This is the thing that made it different from a farmhouse or a cottage or a village dwelling, where the whole household could surrender to the dark at once. A castle was a place of responsibility, and responsibility did not pause at nightfall. Someone always had to be watching. The night watch was not a dramatic thing. It was not a tense vigil, not an anxious scanning of horizons. It was, in its daily reality, something much more ordinary than that. A rotation of duty, a slow walking of familiar paths, a kind of companionable presence that the castle offered to itself through the long, quiet hours. The men who walked the walls at night were not different in kind from the men who did any other necessary work. They were often older soldiers, steady and unhurried men who had learned to be comfortable in their own company, who found something agreeable in the particular quality of night air and the way the world looked from a high place in the dark. The walls of a castle at night had their own character entirely. In daylight, the battlements were a place of business, of signaling and observation, and the ordinary traffic of people moving from one part of the structure to another. At night, they became something more contemplative. The stone beneath a watchman's feet was cold now. Whatever warmth the sun had pressed into it during the day long since released back into the air. His boots were thick-soled leather, and he walked with the unhurried, measured pace of someone who had no destination to reach, only a circuit to complete, over and over from one tower to the next and back again. The view from the walls at night was a thing of considerable beauty, though the watchman might not have used that word for it. Below, the countryside spread out in gradations of dark. The slightly darker mass of woodland, the paler open fields, the silver thread of a stream catching whatever light the sky offered. On a clear night, the stars were extraordinary. The kind of stars that people who live with artificial light have mostly forgotten. So numerous and so bright that they cast a faint, sourceless illumination across the whole landscape, enough to see by if you knew what you were looking for. The moon, when it was present, changed everything. A full moon in a clear sky turned the world below into something almost like day. But softer, all the edges blurred, all the colors replaced by silver and shadow. The watchman would pause in his circuit sometimes and simply stand, looking out not because he was searching for anything in particular, but because the view was there and he was there and there was no reason not to look. A dog might bark somewhere in the village beyond the walls, a long conversational sound that faded without urgency. An owl might pass overhead on silent wings, a shape more felt than seen, gone before the eye could quite follow it. Inside the walls, in the courtyard below, the night had its own small population. The horses in the stable were mostly quiet, occasionally shifting their weight, occasionally making the soft, rhythmic sound of a horse chewing slowly at hay in the dark. The smell of the stable drifted across the yard on still nights, warm and animal and not unpleasant. a smell that spoke of living things settled and comfortable. A stable boy slept in the loft above the horses, as stable boys had slept for as long as there had been stables, wrapped in straw and horse warmth, entirely content. The well in the center of the courtyard stood silent. All day it had been busy. The creak of its rope and the splash of its bucket, a steady rhythm beneath the other sounds of castle life. Now the rope hung still. The water far below was dark and cold and patient, waiting for morning the way water always waits, without any particular investment in the outcome. The gatehouse was another place of quiet wakefulness. Here too a man kept watch, though his watch was of a different character. He sat rather than walked, positioned where he could observe the great gate and the approach beyond it. The gate itself was a substantial thing, heavy oak reinforced with iron, and it was barred at night with a timber so large it took 2 men to lift it into its brackets. There was something reassuring about that bar, about the solid physical fact of it, the way it sat in its brackets with a weight and permanence that required no further thought. The gatehouse keeper might doze in his chair, not deeply, but in that particular light sleep that keeps one ear always open, the sleep of a person who has learned to rest without fully releasing attention. He would have something to eat and drink nearby, a bit of bread from the evening, a cup of small ale, the weak, lightly fermented drink that everyone in the castle consumed throughout the day because it was safer than water and more sustaining than nothing. The bread would be yesterday's, a little harder than it had been at noon, and he would eat it slowly, without hurry, in the way that people eat when eating is less about hunger than about having something to do with the hands in the quiet hours. The chapel, if the castle had one, held its own kind of night. A small oil lamp burned before the altar, a perpetual flame that was someone's responsibility to maintain, to trim and refill, to keep alive through all the hours of darkness. The light it cast was very small and very steady, a warm point in the dark, and the chapel around it was cool and still and smelled of old incense and cold stone and the faint sweetness of beeswax from the candles that had burned during the day's prayers. If you stood in the doorway of such a chapel at midnight, the silence would be of a particular quality. Not empty but full, the way silence is full when it has been inhabited for a long time by something quiet and continuous. The priest or chaplain would have said his night office, the brief prayers that marked the hours of darkness according to the monastic pattern that shaped the rhythm of medieval time. He might be asleep now, or nearly so, in his small chamber adjacent to the chapel, his breathing slow, his hands folded in the habitual arrangement of a person who has spent much of his life in prayer. Through all of this, the slow circuit of the watchman on the walls, the dozing gatekeeper, the sleeping kitchen children, the curtained bed in the Lord's chamber, the patient horses, the still well, the steady lamp in the chapel. The castle held itself together as a single, breathing thing. It was not a building when it was like this. It was something more like a community in its most essential form. People and animals and objects all in their places, all doing what they were meant to do, all part of a pattern so old and so practiced that it required no conscious thought to maintain. The hours moved through the night in the way that hours move when there are no clocks to count them, by the slow turning of the stars overhead, by the changing quality of the darkness, by the body's own interior sense of time passing. The watchman on the walls knew, without being told, when the night had reached its deepest point. That hour somewhere between midnight and dawn, when the cold is at its most settled and the silence is at its most complete. He would pull his cloak a little closer at that hour, not because the cold had changed, but because something in the body asks for that gesture, for the reassurance of warmth drawn in and held. And then, very gradually, so gradually that it was impossible to say exactly when it began, the quality of the darkness would start to shift. Not lighter, not yet, but different. The black becoming something slightly less absolute. The sky to the east acquiring a depth that it had not had before. A sense of distance and dimension returning to the world. The stars in that quarter of the sky would seem to recede a little, as though stepping back to make room for something that was still a long way off. The castle would feel this change before it could see it. The birds would begin first. Always the birds, a single tentative note from somewhere in the ivy on the inner wall. Then another from the trees beyond the moat. Then gradually more, building so slowly that you could not quite catch the moment when it became a chorus. The horses in the stable would stir, lifting their heads, their large dark eyes open in the dimness, reading the morning in some way that had nothing to do with sight. In the kitchen, the banked coals still held their heat, waiting for the kitchen boy to wake and rake them back to life. The herbs in the rushes of the great hall would release their fragrance one more time as the air began to move with the first suggestion of morning draft. The candle stubs in their holders would not be lit again. They were past lighting, but new candles were already waiting in the store, bundled in white and smelling of tallow, ready for the day. The watchman on the walls would complete one last circuit, his footsteps as steady and unhurried as they had been at the beginning of his watch. And he would pause at the eastern battlement and stand for a moment looking out at the horizon where the sky was beginning, very slowly, to remember the color it had been the previous morning. Below him, the fields and woodland and the silver thread of the stream were still mostly dark, still belonging to the night, but there was a sense of them gathering themselves, preparing to become visible again. He would not think grand thoughts at this moment. He would think perhaps about the warmth waiting for him when his watch was done, about the bread in the bowl of something hot that would be ready in the kitchen once the fire was built back up. He would think about his bed, his blankets, the particular pleasure of lying down after a long night of standing and walking. These were the thoughts of a person at the end of a night's work, small and warm and entirely sufficient. And so the castle, which had never truly slept, would begin its long, unhurried process of waking. The same process it had completed every morning for as long as its stones had stood. The same small sounds and smells and movements assembling themselves into a day. The night watch would end as it had begun. Without ceremony, without announcement, one man's quiet vigilance folding itself back into the larger life of the place. Like a breath drawn in and slowly, gently let out again. The day would come, it always came, and the castle would receive it as it received everything, steadily, patiently, with the deep and unhurried calm of something built to last. Its stones still cool from the night, its fires beginning to breathe, its people stirring in their corners and their chambers and their lofts, rising slowly into another ordinary, unremarkable, quietly beautiful day.